everybody. Thanks for coming. We're really excited to be able to present this topic to you as Steve and I both feel that it's really important. I'm Mary Nimchek, and I'm on the Polytechnic campus, in the Polytechnic School, and in the program of aviation.
And I'm Steve Semken. I'm in the School of Earth and Space Exploration here at the campus. And presentation as we're going to talk to you a little bit about designing authentic learning outcomes for teaching and assessment. So it wouldn't be appropriate if we didn't start with what we think are going to be the outcomes for this particular workshop. And we put the verbs in italics for a reason, as you'll see later. Farther along, but here are the outcomes for the workshop that we hope to attain today. That you can explain the meaning of authentic assessment, summarize the purposes of a learning outcome, explain the importance of instructional alignment, and construct aligned learning outcomes suitable for your courses. Mary and I are going to kind of tag team this. So I'm starting off. I'm going to hand off to Mary, but I would say too, it might be maybe the outline campuses. It might be a little difficult, but if you have questions in the whole presentation, I guess speak out, because we can't right now. We can't see you on the screen. So, but go ahead and speak out. And I think certainly that's true for the folks here for 10 people. So I wanted to start with this sort of presentation. We talk about teaching as you were taught. And I think the biggest problem with teaching as you were taught, which is something that we generally try to discourage, is encapsulated by these two scenes from The Wizard of Oz. When you teach the way you were taught, this is generally what you see, right? This is your professor presenting everything in all the glory and all the magnificence, but you never see what's going on behind the curtain. And so you really haven't had any practice in preparing to make that kind of presentation. So this is one of the things that this whole workshop, I think, not just our presentation, but the entire Provost Teaching Academy is designed to help you a little bit with that part of it. So yes, effective teaching practice is an iterative cycle. It's not something that you do once and then you repeat. A good teaching practice requires that you be reflective and that you constantly make innovations as you learn, because it's also a process of learning. I mean, one of the things we talk about is that curriculum and assessment should be educative. You should be able to learn something and adapt each time. And we're going to talk more specifically about assessment today. But all of these elements, curriculum, assessment, and instruction, are aligned. And Mary's going to talk a little bit more about this in a moment. We wanted to introduce this idea, if you haven't heard of it already, of authentic assessment, the value of authentic assessment. Assessment is authentic if it represents what you're really supposed to be doing. One of the big problems we have, and it's certainly a big problem in a large institution like ASU, is that it's very easy to fall into the trap of designing assessments for your students that are easy to score. And you could do it very efficiently. Scantrons, multiple choice. And it's not to say that those assessments don't have a part, but the assessments really, your first design consideration ought to be that they're reflective of what you really want your students to accomplish when they get out of your class. And so Grant Wiggins, whose work I'm going to be citing the next couple slides, along with his colleague McTeague, came up with this idea of sort of the principles of authentic assessment. You can see them here. You can read them. But essentially, it all boils down to what really reflects what you want the students to do when they come out of the class. It represents real work rather than ease of scoring. So realistic, requires judgment and innovation, asks the student to do the subject, if at all possible, replicates or simulates real-world contexts, assesses the ability of a student to apply a broad range of knowledge and skills, and it allows opportunities for a student to get feedback and to practice. So it's iterative. And this is from this book that Grant wrote in 1998 called Educative Assessment. I brought a few of the books that we refer to today. Mary has some too. Sorry for the people on the outlying campuses won't be able to look at them, but they're all cited so that you can look them up.
They're not outlying campuses. They're campuses in different locations.
I'm sorry. Absolutely. You're right. I mean, I'm being very provincial here, aren't I? But what I mean is very right. Okay. Forget that. Sorry about that.
Sorry.
Other campuses of ASU, there's no question. So we should ensure assessment is authentic by aligning curriculum and instruction to assessment. That's the idea here, is that they should be aligned. It's a design process. When you design curriculum and assessment, it's the same sort of thing that designers do in engineering and in the arts. You're creating. And so an adage that you often hear for design is that form follows function, in that outcomes are what drive the design process. So Grant Wiggins and James McTeague back in 2005 came up with a process they call backward design. essentially is that you start with the desired learning outcomes and you move backwards. So in other words, you're not starting with your curriculum, you're starting with what you want the students to have. So stage one is identifying the desired results, which means the learning outcomes. Stage two, determine acceptable evidence, that's your assessments. And then finally, you develop the curriculum and instruction, the learning experiences and instruction. So this informs the design of this, which in turn informs the design of stage three. So today we're going to focus primarily on that stage right here, identifying the desired results. So how do we do this? Okay, how do we align curriculum and instruction to assessment using this principle of backward design? Well, we want to consider, first of all, what kinds of learning outcomes may be desired. We may want our students to meet certain cognitive outcomes relating to being able to reason, do analysis, do calculation, do observations and measurement. We may also have affective outcomes, which relate to such quantities as attitudes, motivations, and preferences. We can teach these things too, and we can assess these things as well. And in some fields, it's psychomotor outcomes. It's actually embodied learning. Okay, I can think, for example, if you're teaching dance, you want to be teaching bodily motions, physical actions. That's another form of learning outcomes, psychomotor. So it may be some combination, or you may focus on just one particular aspect. But a very valuable tool that's available for us to quantify, well, not so much quantify, but design these learning outcomes are called taxonomies of learning. Taxonomies of learning are research-based classifications that we can use to define more specifically what it is we want our students to be able to attain in the learning outcomes. And there have been several. Probably many people are familiar with one of the first ones, 1956. Benjamin Bloom et al. Published the Taxonomy of Educational Objectives. Most people refer to that as Bloom's taxonomy. It was 1956. I actually have an original copy of Bloom's taxonomy over there, but he wants to have a look at it. It's kind of cool. Bloom and his colleagues also a little bit later, in 1964, published a taxonomy of affective educational objectives, relating again to attitudes, motivations, and preferences. But then in 2001, some of Bloom's more junior colleagues, Anderson, Prackwall, and others, published an all-new version of Bloom's taxonomy called the Taxonomy for Learning, Teaching, and Assessing, and that's the one that Mary and I are going to be referring to. So the revised Bloom's taxonomy, unlike the previous one, is two-dimensional. The original Bloom's taxonomy talks specifically about different kinds of cognitive learning processes, remembering, analyzing, that sort of thing. They retained that in the new taxonomy. One of the dimensions is called the cognitive process dimension, and they use different terms now, but they use remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, creating, more or less from lower order to higher order thinking or cognitive processes. But the other innovation is they added another dimension, which is the knowledge dimension, and this is actually categories of knowledge. So you have factual knowledge, knowledge that essentially can be stated and restated. You have conceptual knowledge, which ties the components of factual knowledge together into larger networks. Procedural knowledge, which essentially means skills, the sorts of things that you have to do to learn. And then metacognitive, thinking about thinking, reflecting on your own progress, reflecting on your own knowledge. And so the taxonomy is now two-dimensional, and learning outcomes can be defined in part by the process that you want the students to apply, but also the type of knowledge that they're going to act upon in that process. So the cognitive process dimension, there are 6 basic cognitive processes: remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. Here are the descriptions. I won't go through them now. It's rather laborious, but they're carefully thought out. And again, most of this is rooted in cognitive science research, and also the rest of it in good learning, good teaching practice. And these verbs also have synonyms, so you can use these. And as Mary's going to point out too, the choice of verb becomes very important when you're doing learning outcomes. And there's the knowledge dimensions, the 4 types of knowledge: factual, conceptual, procedural, and metacognitive. Okay, so I think now it's time to hand off to Mary.
I'm gonna take a step back because I'm gonna go back to the table just for just 1 second. I think it's really important, and the reason for doing this is my background is actually in education, and I was used to using Bloom's taxonomy for many, many years. And then, as Steve was saying, that Bloom's students came up with a revised taxonomy in 2001, so it really shook up the system. It was like, oh my goodness, what is this? This is so different. But I think what you'll find valuable as we move through this workshop is this table. You'll see this again. So this table is really valuable, and like Steve pointed out, it has the cognitive process dimensions, or the levels of mastery, or the levels of cognition, if you want to think about it that way. So this is the lowest level of cognition, moving over to the highest level. And the same thing happens in terms of the knowledge, too. In all of our disciplines, we have those facts that our students need to understand before they can move on into higher levels of knowledge. And then the concepts, procedures, and then as Stephen had explained, the metacognitive aspect, the self-regulation. Is the student really getting this? Are they understanding? Are they able to self-assess? But I want to point out this table because you will see it again, and it's so valuable. So I just wanted to spend another moment on this because in the very beginning when we first saw this as educators, it was like, oh my goodness, what is this? But it has turned out to be such a valuable tool. So Steve has already touched on this a little bit, but in education we also call this instructional alignment. And this, if we do instructional alignment, it allows our instruction to be designed and developed very well. It allows us to understand that this is the topic, these are the concepts, these are the strategies that I'm going to use to teach my students. And it also allows us to assess our students appropriately. One of the things that we see oftentimes is that we might be teaching, and then we might be teaching a concept at a certain level, that we want the students to name something or list something or state something, but we don't assess them in that way. We assess them differently. But what instructional alignment allows us to do is to understand the whole instructional design process. What is it that I need to cover here? You know, especially as new professors, oftentimes we're dealt with a new course or modifying a course, or even for those of us that have been teaching a while, we modify our courses quite often. How should I teach this? What else should I cover? Did I teach it well enough last time? So when we consider these things, we are actually talking about instructional alignment. What strategies should I use? Should I use different learning activities this time? Should I incorporate a lab? How am I going to know if my students are progressing? And then I think also some of the most important aspects are, how do I know that they learned? And then another thing is, how do I know that I taught it well enough? Really critical questions to ask. So if we incorporate in instructional alignment, we can be assured that our instruction is doing those things. So this is what it looks like in graph form. So as Steve has already talked about, the learning outcomes are those things that we want the students to know, be able to do once they complete a unit or even our course. So it's those knowledge aspects, the attitudes, the skills. In aviation, we're also teaching skills. We're teaching students how to fly an airplane. We're teaching students how to operate an air traffic control tower. So those sorts of things are incorporated into our curriculum as well. So when we determine what those knowledge, skills, and attitudes are, then we can design our instruction. How am I going to teach that? What materials am I going to use? What activities should I incorporate? So there's that instructional strategies part. And then again, we follow up with the assessment. How well did the students learn, and how well did I teach it? So it's very critical, and you can see how this design will give us a nice, tight package of instruction, teaching, and assessment. So what happens if we don't align our instruction? Maybe you've been in classes like this as a student, that you have no idea what's going on. It's like, where's the instructor going now? What are we going to cover next week? What is on the test? How do I know if I'm progressing? So instructional misalignment can have really adverse consequences for students, because one of the things we want our students to know is to understand what they're going to be confronted with in class. What are we going to be talking about? What are we going to be learning? Also, I think what is really important, too, is that the students have an understanding of the level of mastery, the level of cognition, the level of understanding they should have of these concepts. Are you, the professor, going to want me, the student, to just list these things? Want me to be able to name or identify them? Or do you want me to be able to develop or create, perhaps? So as a student, the learning objectives or the learning outcomes are really important to me. Also, it's going to tell me, how are you going to assess me? What am I going to have to be able to do? What do I have to be able to prove to you that I know this information? So it's really important that our students have this information. It also tells them what types of learning strategies to use. So if they know the level of mastery, if they know the level of cognition, they'll know how to study for your courses. Instructional misalignment can also have adverse effects for us, the instructor. I remember as a new professor here at ASU, I was given 6 new courses to teach, 3 in the fall and 3 in the spring. And even though the previous professor gave me his materials, I could not dissect them. So I thought, wow, you know, it was starting all over. So I needed to have that path. I needed to know, what am I going to teach? What are the outcomes supposed to be for this course, for this unit? How am I going to teach these things? If we don't have instructional alignment, it could be a shotgun effect. You know, that I might cover this week, and next week I'm going to cover that, and I'm going to try and tie these together the next week, and so forth. So if we have a nice tight package using instructional alignment principles, we're going to have that nice tight package that we know this is how we're going to progress. This is what my students are going to be doing. This is how I'm going to be able to identify that my students are actually learning and that I'm actually teaching effectively. So it's really important stuff. So learning outcomes are talked about a lot, and I've done workshops for even the faculty in aviation. And I was just telling Steve this story just a bit ago that when I was doing this similar workshop for the aviation faculty, and I was talking about learning outcomes and designing instruction and things like that, they said, Mary, do we really need to do this stuff? Yeah, we do. We do, for a lot of different reasons. For us as educators, as you've just heard from us, and you probably know this from your past as well, learning outcomes are our foundation. This is how we start. This is what our basis, if you will. And then for the students, as I've mentioned just a minute ago, it gives them that awareness of this is what we're going to cover in this class. This is what we're going to talk about this semester. And this is the level of knowledge that I need to have. This is what we're going to be doing. And also there's those outside stakeholders. A lot of our programs are accredited. And in aviation, we have to show that these are our learning outcomes. These are how they are assessed. This is the evidence, and it matches our accreditation criteria. So I know a lot of our programs are accredited, so you're probably going to be going through a lot of that, matching your learning outcomes with your accrediting body's outcomes, proving that your students have actually achieved those levels of cognition or skills that you've outlined. So it's really important for our stakeholders. So let's talk about the learning outcomes themselves. They're actually pretty simple. There's 2 parts to them. And one is the verb, as Steve has alluded to before. The verb, what do you want the students to do? Do you want them to name something? Do you want them to describe something? So that verb describes cognition. And we'll talk about that in just a second here. But then the second part of it is the subject. What do you want them to be able to do? You want them to be able to name the steps in cell process division. You want them to describe the characteristics of an oligopolistic industry. What is it that you want them to do? What's the subject, the concept that you want them to focus on? So really there's just 2 parts, the verb and then the subject content reference.
And these taxonomies help you find the verb.
Right, exactly. So here's the verbs. So here's the taxonomy table. Again, this is Bloom's revised taxonomy, as Steve has already indicated. And so these are the verbs. So as you look across the levels of cognition, you can see that the verbs are describing those levels very well. So on the very left-hand side, remember, this is the lowest level of cognition, if you will. List, state, name, identify. Very low levels of cognition. But as you move across the taxonomy, you can see that that level increases. Those levels of mastery increase. So as you're moving across, you can see that the students are now having to explain or discuss, analyze, and so forth. When you get over to the very right-hand side here, the highest level of cognition, this is what we also call conditional knowledge, that your students can use the information that you've provided them in any condition. They can create, they can develop, they can plan. So highest levels of cognition. So you'll determine the levels of cognition based on what you're teaching and what your outcomes need to be for your particular course. Oftentimes, if you're teaching a beginning course, in maybe some of the 1-100 level courses, you might have a lot of these types of verbs, these types of learning objectives here. But as you move on into some of the capstone courses, you might be over here. So it kind of depends on the course that you're teaching, what the outcomes of that course are supposed to be, and that will determine your levels of cognition. So, as we said before, there's 2 parts. So typically, the learning objectives are worded in this way. The student will be able to describe something and you'll be referencing your content. So it's usually the student will be able to. So you can have learning objectives for every unit, for your courses. One of the things that I also do too is I write the learning objectives for my classes. Every time I teach, I write the learning objectives up on the board because I want the students to know this is what we're going to talk about tonight. This is what we're going to have to, that you're going to have to know. And so I also point that out that you're going to see this stuff again because they're going to see that on the test, and they will. And so the reason that I do that is I want the students to understand what's coming, what our topics are going to be for the evening in class, the levels that they're going to have to understand this material at, whether it's describe or plan or something like that, whatever that verb is, they're going to have to know it to that level, and then they will have to know it for a midterm or a final project.
Okay, another hand up here. So I wanted to give you an example of how this could work in practice, and I apologize, it's a kind of a wordy slide, but this is actually taken from my syllabus. I teach a course called Earth Science in Arizona Southwest. It's a 300-level course. A lot of majors take it, but it's actually also open to non-majors. It's actually cross-listed in sustainability. So I do try to serve a very broad student audience with that. They just have to have a couple of introductory Earth Science courses to qualify. And in that, I state the course learning goals very specifically in the syllabus. We are essentially obligated by the Arizona Board of Regents to put our learning outcomes into all our syllabi. I don't know if you're aware of that, but that is a fact. But I actually break them out into 3 levels. And each class I call a lesson. You know, you can call it a lecture or a lesson or a lab or whatever. I refer to them as lessons. And for each lesson, and I'm going to give you some specific examples in a moment, I give the students somewhere between 2 and 6 essential ideas. Okay, these are the main points that we're going to cover in this lesson. Concise summary statements, and I call them what you should know. Okay, this is a good statement of facts, conceptual knowledge, even procedural knowledge that you should know. And then from these, I get what I call the learning expectations. And I borrowed that term expectations from the Next Generation Science Standards that some people may be familiar with. They have what are called performance expectations. And these are statements of what students should be able to do after they fully participate in the lesson and do whatever after lesson homework. And so these are, again, on the basically what you should know, what you should be able to do after each lesson. And then they all support what I call the 5 learning outcomes for the entire course. And I want to point out again, so as Mary has said, it starts out, it says, you should be able to do all of the following if you complete this course. And I put the verbs in italics because, once again, these are verbs that are taken directly from the revised Bloom's taxonomy. And in the case of the learning outcomes, since these are for the entire course, I've tried to use higher order verbs as much as possible. As you'll see in a moment, for the learning expectations, the verbs can be a mix of lower order and higher order cognitive processes. There's nothing wrong, I should say, there's nothing wrong with lower order cognitive processes. There is a place for those. However, if you're talking about a learning progression for your students, you probably want them to move from lower order to higher order over the course of the class. So you can mix them up. So 6 learning outcomes. And I say basically when you're done with this class, I hope that you'll be able to do all 6 of these things. Deconstruct the geologic record of Arizona. Reconstruct the geological evolution of Arizona. Attribute the nature and distribution of natural resources and natural hazards to geologic processes. And then this course is also a science and society course in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Every BS student in CLAS has to take 2 courses that satisfy a science and society requirement, and that specifies that they have to be able to relate the science to societal needs and societal problems. And that's what these 2 learning outcomes relate to. And then finally, I like this as it's a place-based course. I like them to be able to share what they've learned in some way with the community, so they want to use their knowledge of Arizona and the Southwest in different aspects of their life. So this is very difficult to read, but I'll walk you through it. This is actually what I create for every one of my lessons. This is a grid that organizes the learning outcomes. And so I start on the left with organizing questions. This is for a lesson that I call the lay of the land. It's fairly early in this semester. It's about the topography of Arizona and the Southwest. We talk about topographic differences. So when I give a lesson, the first thing I do is I present several questions for the students to think about. And I call them organizing questions. So there are 2. How does topography vary across Arizona and the Southwest? And is topographic variation across the Southwest related to the underlying geology? So these are questions that we're going to address over the course of the lesson. And by the time we get to the end of the lesson, we will have come up with 3 essential ideas. Now, these are what are mentioned in the syllabus as the statements of what students should know after each lesson. And the 3 essential ideas, one is that the natural Southwest is subdivided into 4 topographically distinct provinces. Topography, an expression I like to give my students, a little buzz phrase, is topography rules the Southwest, which means that variations in topography in turn influence climate, water resources, and ecology across the Southwest. And then finally, the topographic provinces of the Southwest differ in types and structural arrangements of rocks. So these are all statements of ideas. And this is, again, when the students finish the lesson, they should know these 3. Okay, this is one of the statements of know. Now, the learning expectations, I have 8 learning expectations that are cross-referenced to the ideas, generally 2 or 3 for each idea. So the learning expectations are essentially the lower range learning outcomes, like what Mary was talking about. They involve a verb and a subject, and they draw on the revised Bloom's taxonomy. So distinguish the 4 topographic provinces. All right, that's sort of a mid-level cognitive process. It's not at the bottom, not at the top. Contrast patterns of elevation, relief, and steepness of slopes across the Southwest. Sketch. Now, that's actually not a verb per se in the taxonomy, but it's a create verb, essentially. So sketch an accurate profile that traverses all 4 topographic provinces, so on and so forth. Contrast patterns of climate, drainage, and ecology. Explain influences. Contrast the influence of topography on climate in the Southwest versus other regions. Sketch cross-sections and classify the major rock types that you find. So all of these are verbs in the, except for the sketch, which I draw out of the create. These are all cognitive process verbs from the taxonomy, and then these are the subjects. So each one, yes?
I'm holding on to this question for a few minutes. I think it's probably appropriate with your specific examples, and that's, you know, in Bloom's taxonomy, they give us many of these verbs and things, but ultimately what you need to do is sort of relate that into like measurable, accessible quantities, right? Right. So any advice on how to do that? I know that's very specific to the course you're teaching, right. But when we hear a word like sketch, that's obvious what the student would have to do then. But distinguish between this and this. Well, how does that then relate to like a measurable, accessible?
That's a great question, and I would say what I do and what I would recommend is keep in mind how the student is actually going to demonstrate that. Okay, so for example, I said here, I didn't say the whole thing. I said distinguish the 4 topographic provinces on a relief or topographic map. So I could put a map down in front of the student and say, you find me the 4 provinces. But here, okay, contrast patterns of elevation, relief, and steepness of slopes. I can think of several ways. One way is, again, to look at the map and say, look, it's higher over here, it's lower over here. Or they could make a sketch if they want to, or they could do it in writing. They could say, northern Arizona is higher than southern Arizona, that sort of thing. So that's a great question. I think that all of these expectations, I've tried to work very hard to make sure that these expectations are something that can easily be produced by the student and can readily be assessed.
Oh, and so that's a very good example. But I mean, for people who are just starting out that don't have the experience,
right?
And I confess I've only seen Bloom's taxonomy for the last couple of months since I got into teaching. So, when I was learning, I was more focused on the research side.
It's a great question, and maybe Mary would have something else to suggest. I would just say, as you come up with these things, keep in mind how the student would actually meet those expectations. Okay. And then the final column, these are the 6 learning outcomes for the whole course. And what I want to make sure is that every one of these meets at least one of these. Okay. If I can't, and the star is like the primary and the check is the secondary, say, well, they'll meet for sure one outcome, and they may also secondarily meet another. And if I can't check at least one of these columns, then I have to reconsider whether this is a valid expectation for the course, because it's not meeting the overall outcomes of the course. And the last thing I'll say about this is that how many of you have had students come up to you before an exam and say, are you going to do a study guide? Okay, students love to ask for study guides. That's the study guide. If you present them with that, you've already given them the study guide. Say, you need to do this. And if you can do all these things, then you're going to do quite well in this course. I have another colleague, Steve Reynolds, who calls this a what-to-know list. And essentially, it's the same thing. He has, at the beginning of the semester, he hands out this long list for the entire course. It has like 100 or 200 of these things and say, this is what you need to know by the end of the class. And there are 30 lessons, and there's something like 8 to 10 of these per lesson, so it works out to be somewhere in the vicinity of 300 learning expectations that they have to meet. And they don't necessarily get assessed on all of them, Okay, I reserve the right to pick some of these. I don't necessarily have the time or ability to assess all of them, but I say I will assess these. You won't be asked to do something that doesn't fit into that category. So I think that's it for me. So, question.
Well, so on your last slide, the green box, the
learning outcomes.
Learning outcomes. So, so in my syllabus, I would put the learning outcomes, but I guess this is a general question. At Arizona State, there are not those kinds of outcomes specifically for every course. Is that correct? I mean, some courses are going to be assessed on specific outcomes.
The whole.
Yeah, I'm curious, like if there's a way for the courses at ASU to access like specific outcomes that we need to be making sure that we meet.
Oh, you're talking about like standards for
yeah,
degree
anything
programs
like that, or those just the outcomes from the
well,
syllabus?
courses that meet university requirements like SQ and literacy and that sort of thing. When they are assigned that criterion, they have to demonstrate that they meet a certain set of criteria for that. So like, I'm most familiar with SG and SQ because I'm in science, and there has to be mathematical reasoning, there has to be working with data, there have to be certain things that a course must demonstrate, and there's a faculty committee that oversees that. It says you will not get an SQ rating for your class unless you can show this.
Your unit should be able to provide you with that information because, as Steve says, every course goes through various levels of review, so they should have that documentation.
Okay.
And mine is not. This course does not fit any of those because it's science and society. They're mutually exclusive by design. If it's an SNS course, it doesn't meet any of the other ones. So, but I had to go through approval by the Science and Society Committee to make sure that I was meeting the objectives that they specified. So, there was another question.
Oh no, I was just going to add to your point. I know in my specific case, we're ABET accredited as well. So sometimes there's external third-party accreditation committees that will oversee your curriculum. Now, I'm not so sure about your specific case, but in my case, we're looked at by the university, we're looked at by ABET, we're looked at also our students take the Fundamentals of Engineering exam, or I think it's called Engineering and Training exam now. They take that in their senior year, and so all these are sort of goals that we have to prepare them to be able to either to pass an exam or to meet the criteria to get the external accreditation. So that might help. Also, if you have a curriculum committee for your program, then they might be able to give you some guidelines as well about what your course might need to satisfy in order for them to get a certain accreditation.
I'd like to add to that, too. I was going to also state that accreditation is really important for a lot of the programs here. I know in aviation, we just had a meeting about this the other day, that all of our course objectives have to, what we call, map into the aviation accreditation. There's an A through K, similar to ABET, that we have to make sure that our objectives map into the accreditation body's objectives, and we have to prove that. So I would maybe check with your department chair as to what those might be.
Now, the way I use these in a oh, sorry, you had a question. Yes.
Yeah, I have a general question too. What if your students just don't care about your learning objectives and then do badly on the test?
I've got a few of those in my class too. I'd really like to know the answer to that.
That's an affective.
Because you know that grid. I've got a few students that live in the top left-hand corner of that grid only. Okay.
Is this a required course that they begrudgingly take?
It is.
Or is it?
Here's the context. I teach exclusively online, and so for each module, I have this banner, "Welcome to this topic," right? And then at the end of this module, you'll be able to list all the learning objectives. What I was told by more experienced colleagues is that students skip over that immediately. Like no one reads the objectives.
They may not at the beginning, but you want to have those out there. You definitely want to have them out, and they will care more about them, I think. Maybe not in, I don't know, maybe your experience has been different, but in my experience, as the semester goes along and they realize they have to focus their efforts and they want to see what they've been doing, they pay more attention to this sort of thing.
And if somebody complains about their grade,
right,
and you have documented what is expected in this course right up front, you are protected from
It is in a student's nature to push the envelope as far as she or he can, and so that's why it's important to have this, because you have to have some standard.
I was just going to make a comment that I don't know about online teaching, because I imagine it'd be much harder to do that because you don't actually see the students. But what I've been doing with my students over the years is to have conversations with them in class about these things, explain why they are the way they are, and it's really about changing the culture, because they come with this, they're programmed because that's their experience with learning, right, with taking courses, is that there is a grade, there is a test, and what do I need to do to pass the test and get a grade? So you really have to kind of try to shift that mentality and explain to them that it's not just about the grade, it's not just about, and some of them will understand, some of them won't, but I think it's a conversation that I think we all have to have with students to try and change that culture. One of the challenges that I have, and that's the question I had for you guys, is when it comes to quantifying in terms of 81 versus 82 versus 83, because I've tried to put it in terms of what a C looks like, what a B looks like, what an A looks like, and students still want that exact number. And I'm not sure how to manage that and how to, how to either translate that into, that's those that small variation, or how to talk to them in a way that will convince them that we need to do it in more broad terms as opposed to specific numbers.
Well, do you want to comment on that?
Are you talking about the points that are given, or the percentages, or?
Because I create rubrics to go along with that too.
Right,
and then in the rubrics, sometimes I've tried with something like what an A range is like, what a B range, C range. But then they still want to know, is this an 81 versus an 82 or an 82.5? How do I go into that?
Where did that 1 point go, right?
Right.
Yeah, they want those decimals and whatnot.
Well, rubrics are a good way to do it. That's probably the best way. Do you award points for everything they do?
Let's see.
I mean, like even just participating in class, anytime they have to write something down or hand it in, is it worth points toward the course?
I have assignments.
Okay, because there's research that indicates that that's also a good way to keep students motivated and to promote active learning, is to actually, it's more like a sense of ownership that everything they do is worth something. It's more difficult for you to keep track and to grade and so on. But
yeah, that's one of the challenges, because with all the responsibilities that we have as system professors, especially, it's been hard to track them.
it is.
Do you give the students the rubrics?
Yes,
Yeah.
they're available on the syllabus, and that's the form where you can make their
Well, the thing is that, I mean, what I tell my students is that when you get down to the level of points, sometimes it's very difficult to, where it comes down. But in my case, I do make everything they do in class, even I break up my lectures with small hands-on activities that they fill out on 5x8 index cards. And I collect those at the end of my teaching assistant, and I grade them the same day. It is a lot of work, I realize that. But the response is that there's no major point block. Everything they do is broken up into relatively small assignments, so that as long as they maintain a pattern of diligent work and so on, they're going to be fine. Even if they miss one or two, it's not going to cause them major problems.
But do you do in such a way that they accumulate points as they
Yes.
assignment?
Yeah, they get
or
1,000
the way
points
that
for the
they have,
class.
But then they get, for example, within this assignment, they can get 10 points, but then they get 9 or 8.
Exactly. If they do a complete job, and there's where the rubric comes in. If you do this much of a job, you'll get 10 points. If you do less, you'll get 6, 3, something like that. You spell it out for them. And then I don't grade on a curve. I have a very specific numbering scale, and so they know how they're going to do. They get 1,000 points for the course. They can also go above it if they do extra work, and so they can get an A+. But and there's a cutoff. And then when the time comes to grade, yeah, you can always maybe be a little bit flexible, and they're right on the board depending on how they do it. But in your syllabus, you make it very specific. That's how I do it.
I just want to bring up one quick point, which is, and I didn't realize this till a couple of years ago, is that a lot of students have this view that, let's say they have a paper or a test, that they're starting at 100. And things are being subtracted from that 100, and that's why they fight you for the, how did I lose that point? Well, you didn't have that point to begin with. So, on the first day of class, I tell them, on your test, you're starting with 0, and you're earning each point on top of that. With the paper, you're starting at 0, and you earn the point. And a lot of them are like, oh, God. Yeah, all right. So, and not all of them will get that difference, but it shifted my thinking because when I'm grading the test, that's what they see, -3, -5. And they go, well, I must be starting from 100, but it's actually the opposite.
That's a really good point, and I think that also, to my mind, shows the value of doing sort of incremental grades too, because in my class, the grade book starts out with a 0 at the beginning of the semester, and then every day they get 10 more points if they did something. And so they're gradually rising toward 1,000. And they know from the syllabus what they have to reach. And they can see themselves going up, but they don't see like a big chunk up here or a big chunk not up here. So the one other thing I wanted to mention about this is when I actually teach the class, okay, these are what they see. They don't see this. They get this in the syllabus. This is mostly for me to sort of keep track of what I'm doing. But during the class, I do PowerPoints, and I start each block with the question, and then the essential ideas get woven into the presentation, and at the very end of every lesson, I have 2 slides, one with the essential ideas and one with the learning expectations. And that goes up on Blackboard, so they can come back and see it later if they want to. So, I've probably gone pretty far over, so. Do you have any more questions?
I just got a follow-up question. I'm thinking about that idea of the particular. So are you basically assessing them pretty much every class, right? So how do you handle absences?
I make it very clear in my syllabus if they have an unexcused absence, they've missed the points for that day. And unexcused means they did not make arrangements with me ahead of time. If they have some kind of, the university does sanction certain activities, and I say if they tell me ahead of time that they're going to do a university sanctioned activity, I will work with them to get the credit. But if they just decide one day they're not going to show up, then they've lost the credit for that day. But again, it's only 10 points out of 1,000. So it's not a killer, because I understand problems happen.
And I do the same thing. We do a lot of in-class activities, and if the student misses, it's because, and they miss those points, and they can't make them up because they weren't there to participate.
Right.
But again, if they have an excused absence.
Yeah, let me interject here, because this is a very important part of university policy, and every year I get complaints coming up to my office about it. If a student is participating in a university-sanctioned activity, whether that's a dance recital, whether it's an athletic activity, they have to have the opportunity to make up that work. It's just they're taking their own time to represent the university in different activities. It's very important. Similarly, for religious reasons. This always comes up in the fall with the Jewish high holidays. We get a complaint coming in, somebody saying, well, I missed 2 days because of the high holidays, and my instructor told me, well, those are your 2 excused absences. No. That's not the way it works, because then you're telling Jewish students, well, if you get the flu in November, forget it. You flunk the course. So it's very important for people to be aware that university-sanctioned events and religious occurrences do not count towards whatever policy you may have, 2 or 3 excused absences. The students have to be given the opportunity to make up that work.
But I do ask them and kind of insist they've got to give me an advance warning.
Oh yeah, that's perfectly, yeah.
They can't come afterwards and say, oh, by the way, I had something and now I'd like to make it up. So, and I'll work with them.
Comment and a question. I think comment is, at least as a new professor, I learned so much more from the interaction dialogue than I ever thought I would. So when we break out on maybe a little bit of a tangent, I think this is extremely valuable. And second, to your class style, I was curious, do you ever have the case where students might reach one of the thresholds for a grade that they would like before you finish the curriculum? Because in my specific case, I have 30 modules as well, but based on something like ABET or whatever, I have to cover most, if not all, of those modules. But if the student reaches, let's say, a threshold for a C based on the 1,000-point scale, then there's more of a lack of motivation for them to even come for the remaining modules or even take the final if it's possible. In fact, actually, in a lot of courses that I've seen in CB, students could still pass the class with a D, assuming they did well enough throughout the semester without even taking the final and getting a 0 for it or something.
Well, in my practice, I haven't run into too many students who are satisfied with this. They'll take a C if that's the best they can do, but when they get halfway through, they're all still thinking A, I think, in my experience. So they're all, and you really can't get an A in my class unless you make it all the way to the end.
So you have to sort of structure the scale such
Yeah.
that they have to be there for all
Yeah.
of the written assessments
It's
through
spaced
the end.
out. I tell them at the beginning that they're going to be 30 class sessions and they're going to get 10 points. It's like taking attendance, except I don't take attendance. They have to submit one of these index cards with their work on it, and they get 10 points for that. And I say that's 300. There are 30 lessons, 10 points. 300 out of 1,000 points is going to be this class participation. So yeah, they've got to be doing it right up till the end of it.
Yeah, that's a substantial amount for class participation too.
I wanted to ask if any of the other campuses had questions. We haven't heard anything. I don't know. We've been sort of not seeing on the screen. So are any folks at the other campuses have some questions?
Steve, we have a question for you.
Yes.
Can you hear us?
Yes.
Go ahead.
What are the class sizes? I mean, you're talking about grading index cards 30 times. I mean, we can't see the screen at all, so.
You can't. Oh, no. You can't see what's up there now?
No.
A big bright light.
A big bright light is all we see.
Oh, they're just seeing you.
Oh, are you seeing me then?
Yeah, we can see everything. It's just we're seeing a glare off the TV.
I thought the PowerPoint slides were supposed to be visible to you folks. They're not?
They are not today.
Oh, where are IT folks?
They all left.
They left. I apologize. We thought all along you were seeing those slides.
No.
I'm not sure what to do about that now, except of course the slides will be available.
Yeah, let's post the slides online, but the question is about sort of how does this scale to large class sizes?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing is that there are a lot of people who, instead of using, say, index cards that they grade, they'll use clickers. Okay, that's another thing where you have sort of immediate feedback where you don't have to grade. If you have a class of 200 or 300 students, then probably it's more practical for you to use some kind of electronic student response device. What I actually do in my class, this class has 62 students, so I'm sort of at the outer edge of what I'm able to do grading, and I have a teaching assistant, an undergraduate teaching assistant, who took the course previously, who comes into my office in the afternoon, and we work on the cards together, and we have a chance to talk about what they did. It takes about an hour to do that. But I teach a large lecture of 150 students, so that's a medium lecture by ASU standards. What I do for there is I give them a little quiz question in class, and they have to go back online later and respond to it within 8 hours, okay? The quiz is kept open, so it's kind of like a clicker, except they do it on their own time. If they don't come to class, they won't get the quiz question. They can see it and do it. So then there's sort of an electronic assistant. I don't know.
Yeah, and I have some larger classes too over in aviation, and I do group work a lot of times, and I do discussion board things where the students are actually putting things in a discussion board. Even during class, it might look like they're doing something else, but I can see that they're typing responses into the discussion board, and then I'm able to look at that later. So I think there's a lot of different instructional strategies that can be used in order to assess the students too.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be. I like index cards. It's kind of old school. They're 5 by 8 white index cards lined on one side, blank on the other, and they're essentially half the size of an 8.5 by 11 sheet. And so if I want them to do a sketch, they do that on the blank side. If they want them to write something, they do it on the line side. And they have to fill those cards. Basically, that's the standard, is that they can't just write a few words down on a card and call it done. But it also doesn't require them to write a book because it's only 5 by 8. It's only so much you can fit on it. So that wasn't my idea. I got that from a paper in the Journal of College Science Teaching. So that's another thing. It's a good idea if you can to read things like the Journal of College Science Teaching or the Journal of Teaching in your discipline for that reason. More questions from the other campuses? I hope that answered the question.
Yeah.
I don't know if you all can hear me. I have one question regarding attendance. So as a newer professor, I have a class of 80 students, and I started off the semester with a fairly strict attendance policy. But I've been struggling with sort of parity for some students, because a lot of students that I have either work several jobs, several full-time jobs, have families, and that kind of thing. And so I'm sort of struggling with how to, so in other words, for a lot of these students, they're undergraduates, but they're not having the quote-unquote typical undergraduate experience where they live on campus and just kind of roll out of their dorm room and come to class in the morning. Like I said, a handful of my students actually work overnight and come straight to my class from their jobs. And so I've been really struggling with kind of parity in the sense of being fair to students who may have different life circumstances than those that may be living on campus and have an easier time coming to class. I don't know if any of you have had those sort of experiences or can speak to that. And by the way, I've really enjoyed these workshops and the presentation today as well. It's been very, very useful.
I actually have had that issue, and it's a challenging one because it's part of the student demographic that we're dealing with. We have a lot of students who have very complicated and busy lives, who are, as you say, not the sort of traditional residential college student, and they're the ones who oftentimes are in greater danger of just dropping out because it becomes too hard. So I think that, you know, you have those one-on-one conversations. You try to come up with some alternative learning plans or lessons for them. You know, parity, well, yeah, but it's not a level playing field. You know, some people have challenges, and we really want our students to be able to persist, to be able to get their degrees. We don't want them to get so discouraged as to feel that, well, if I have a family and I'm working a job, that it's impossible for me to complete a college education, because that's what we're all about. We're all about access. So I do think that it's better to err on the side of working with those students and adjusting when you need to, rather than insisting that it's unfair to the others if you're giving a little bit of extra flexibility to students, because, you know, it's just different. You know, better to keep them here and make it, you know, because probably those students are working even harder, are facing bigger challenges than your students who don't have those issues, the more traditional residential students. So that would be my comment. I mean, I have had a student who was a full-time student, a full-time worker, and the single father of a 2-year-old daughter. Did I cut him some slack? Yeah, I did. He didn't even ask for it, but I did it anyway. So, you know, those are our students, and we want them to stay our students.
Yeah,
and there are more than we think out there, too, and a lot of them won't even come and talk to you. So that's a challenge, too, that I've discovered. Yeah, a couple will come to talk to you, but for everyone that comes and talks to you, there's like, they're representing 10 or 12 of their peers, or whatever. I don't know. I just made up the number, but.
Right. Yeah, and if you notice habitual absences or late work, you know, it's useful when you reach out to a student to say, is there something that I need to know? You know, I'm concerned, you know, are there particular circumstances that are getting in the way here that we need to talk about?
Yeah, and I think that as far as this fairness issue, and also speaking to the students who aren't speaking up, who are in similar circumstances, is you offer the kind of trade-off to everybody. So it's not, this is a special case, you get special treatment, but when I first went to my required departmental course, it was 40 students. I had to, you know, I took attendance every time, and now it's like 135. And I started getting a lot of students. We have 30 to 40 are reentry students, so they are students that have families, they're coming back, there are lots of different circumstances. So I actually modified it and actually stopped taking attendance, although I told them if you don't come to class, you will flunk the test. You won't understand the information. But if you have to miss a class, get the notes, come and see me during my office hours. I can go over the notes with you. And then if you need to have attendance points, then you can have these alternative assignments which would be available to other students to perhaps help help kind of soften the blow of attendance points that they have to miss class. Child is sick, and kids get sick all the time.
I think also part of it, as I said, maybe I'm a little bit more rigid than some. I put things in the syllabus, and I really do try to stick to that. But also, I believe very strongly in low stakes, not high stakes. If everything is low stakes, if it's progressive demonstration learning, then the occasional problem is not going to be a big issue. And I do make myself available to meet with students. I put all of the materials on Blackboard so that if they do miss a class, they can still do the homework, they can still move ahead, and they're welcome to get in touch with me and they ask questions by email or come and see me and talk to them. So, because I mean, the one other, not to say that this is all, because this is all really important, but the one other counter I would have is that it's difficult for me to be in the position of arbiter, being an arbiter of what's a real legitimate problem and what's not. So, so I'm as sympathetic as I try to be as sympathetic as anybody, but sometimes it's hard to know, what's really going on if the student isn't going to tell the whole story. So that's why I tend to fall back on my syllabus, but I do also try to give students alternatives. And there's extra credit too. I do make certain things available as extra credit that they can do in off hours. They can do it other times. They can make up for something. More questions? Are you ready for the? Sure. Head back to you.
Yes. Hello.
Oh. No, you got to hit that microphone and.
Okay.
Is it on?
Yeah, I think is our microphone on here? Can you guys hear me?
The other campuses, you can't see what's on that slide there, unfortunately, right?
No.
I'm so sorry. I thought all along you were seeing me.
On their end.
You guys hear us on the West Campus?
Yes.
Oh, hi. I have a question, actually. So in my classes, I intend to do a lot of group work, and part of what I want to do is to prepare students for the collective action problems that they may face, having group assignments in the workforce or in their future academic programs. So my inclination is to give everybody the same grade because I don't want to evaluate them individually because I want to see how they work together. But I'm also concerned about the negative kind of implications of that. So any kind of ideas with regards to group work, and then also a lot of the students I'll be working with are going to be graduate students, master's students specifically. So any tips in terms of scaling this up for graduate students? Thank you.
In regards to group work, one of the things that I have found over the years is you're exactly right. You can't give the whole group an A because a lot of the students participate and then some don't. But what I've instituted in the last several years is a peer review process. And I have the students actually grade themselves. So they'll grade themselves as well as the other members of their group and then tell me why. Why did you get that grade? Why are you giving your group members these grades too? So to give me some introspection of what happened in that group. Oftentimes what I've seen, and I've actually been surprised by this, is students will grade themselves lower. And they'll grade themselves lower than their peers and say, well, so-and-so should get an A because she did this or he did that. I'm going to give myself a B because I don't think that I, did as much or I didn't attend all the meetings and so forth. So that's worked well for me.
I would just say that I know in my field, and I'm presuming in others too, there's actually been quite a bit written about how to manage group instruction effectively. Because, you run into problems of people not carrying their load or maybe personality conflicts and so on. And there is a lot written in the teaching literature about that, so you can probably find for your discipline. My experience has been typically that in the few cases where I've had problems, I've generally had one or two members come to me talk to that student.
I'd like to chime in a little bit too because I've been doing work for a long time. And the two things that I implement is that, so for the collective project of the group work, everyone gets the same grade. But on top of that, they have a peer evaluation that's worth about as much, almost as much as the product itself, and that's a separate grade. I don't have students grade themselves because often I find that they grade themselves low even if they did the whole work. So like that's a problem with some very humble students who actually did the work. They just don't give themselves full credits of what they did. A second thing that I did is that I did team building in the first day that the groups have formed. But also, I told them explicitly that if someone is not carrying their weight, you can throw them out. And I encouraged them to throw people out of their teams if they're not doing their job. And so the people being thrown out actually will have to plead their case to another team and join another team or do the whole project by themselves. And that has actually worked very well in the past, when they actually got authorized to do that.
But don't you also run into the situation where students will say, okay, the group got, let's say we got a group grade of a B, but yet I was the rock star, so therefore I should get an A, while everyone else, should get less than that. So their individual accountability component should be an A, and so then, they would have an A and a C average together and maybe get a B, but everyone's going to write that about themselves in their evaluation if the group doesn't perform well.
Well, in those cases, I encourage them to go talk to me if there's any early signs of problems. Because then, if there's one person who carries the whole team, then I would allow them to move to another team and just leave the loafers by themselves.
Hitchhikers, I think, is what Felder refers to them as.
Another thing too, in this class we do have a final project. It's the final exam. I allow them, if they want to, they can form groups of up to 3 people. But I also tell them that I have a rubric of what they have to do, and I say, if you're going to be a group of 3, take that rubric and multiply it by 3. That's what I expect to see. So there's also a greater expectation of workload on it. I will be grading you that way. There will be. Oh my gosh, it is.
Unfortunately, I think we're out of time. I'm happy to stay.
Yeah.
And
I can
stick
stay
around
for a little while.
and talk about some of these things. And we really apologize that you couldn't see the PowerPoint slides.
Yeah.
But we'll make sure that you get those. Steve and I also have a workbook on how to develop learning outcomes.
It's yours.
And we'll send that out. So make sure that your names are on the agenda.
That would be great.
We'll make sure that gets mailed out.
And of course, you can always email us questions anytime. Happy to entertain those. Appreciate your participation. Yeah, I also apologize to the other campuses. All along we thought you were seeing those slides. The IT folks, I guess they left it that way, and unfortunately we weren't in a position to fix it. But we will make sure you get the slides so you can see them.
Thank you all for your attendance and your participation. We've really enjoyed the participation, the questions that you guys have. It helps all of us learn. I learned from you, and I learned from the discussion, so thank you all for coming, and hopefully this was beneficial for you.